The atmosphere outside the Columbus Convention Center was charged with expectation, as a liberal reporter attempted to corner J.D. Vance with a heavy question. But his ruthless retort left the entire audience in stunned silence. In order to hear J.D. Vance speak live, Ohio supporters have been assembling since the early hours of the morning. Some have held banners, while others have clutched signs with bold lettering that makes it obvious where they are. News outlets' cameras line the back of the venue, their red recording lights flickering as a journalist gets ready for coverage. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, with conversations humming throughout the crowded auditorium and an undercurrent of excitement rippling through the crowd. The stage, bathed in bright overhead lights, stood at the front, simple, unembellished. The podium bearing the senator's name, volunteers, and matching T-shirts handed out pamphlets, while security kept a watchful eye on the doors. Then the room shifted. A sudden swell of cheers erupted as J.D. Vance stepped onto the stage. His entrance was deliberate, calm, composed. Dressed in a dark suit, no tie, his sleeves slightly rolled up, he projected the image of a man ready for straight talk. He gave a brief nod to the crowd, adjusting the microphone as the applause continued. "Folks," he began, his voice steady, familiar, "it's good to be here with you tonight." The response was immediate. More cheers, scattered whistles. He waited, letting the excitement settle before continuing. "We're at a turning point," he said, "a moment where we have to decide, do we keep pushing forward, building a country we can be proud of, or do we let the same voices, the same broken policies, keep dragging us down?" A wave of agreements swept through the crowd. Some clapped, others shouted their approval. "But let's be real," he added, leaning slightly into the microphone. He began a speech, his tone alternating between measured and passionate, discussing the economy, crime, and policies he felt were failing the American people. Each sentence was greeted with enthusiastic applause and affirmations from the audience. "We have a fight on our hands, which is why we're here to talk about what comes next." The occasional call from the rear of the room, and then, in the middle of everything, a voice broke through the atmosphere. It wasn't a cheer from a fan or an enthusiastic reaction, but rather a purposeful, focused, and harsh enough voice to turn heads. "Vance, Senator, do you genuinely think that everything appeared to freeze for a brief moment?" The voice belonged to a journalist who was sitting close to the press area. Her notepad was on her lap, and she was standing erect and certain that she wasn't heckling the audience. Instead, she was challenging them, as evidenced by some of them shifting in their seats. The room's once soaring excitement now lingered in ambiguity, but something in J.D., the tension in the room, continued to rise despite Vance's face, like a sudden rush of wind. J.D. Vance was in the middle of a sentence. His voice was heavy when the interruption came, and suddenly everyone's attention was on the source, a woman holding a microphone close to the media area. "You talk about pushing these issues to my knee or about creating something better. But what do you say to the people who feel left behind by your policies, the ones who accuse you of ignoring reality?" Andrea Holt was not just any reporter. She was a well-known journalist from a major liberal network. Her reputation preceded her sharp relentlessness, known for forcing politicians into awkward corners. She didn't flinch as the room turned toward her. A murmur went through the crowd, with some groaning and rolling their eyes, others muttering to themselves, and some fans scoffing with their arms crossed in anticipation of a fight. J.D. Vance did not respond right away. His hold on the platform tightened a little, but his face remained composed as he looked around the audience, as though gauging the significance of the moment. The woman wasn't finished. "People are having a hard time, Senator. You stand here preaching about development, yet they can't afford homes, and their earnings aren't keeping up. What do you say to them?" He could have sidestepped it and moved on like most politicians would, dismissing her, making a joke, and energizing the crowd. But that wasn't his style. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the podium. His voice was even deliberate. "I've done a lot of interviews and debates, but I always find it interesting how some people frame these conversations." Silence descended on the auditorium. Vance went on, "You bring up wages and housing struggles, and you're right, people are hurting." But Andrea didn't respond, at least not outwardly. She waited with her microphone, ready for the inevitable back and forth. The way he said her name made it obvious that this wasn't going to be a prepared response. "When was the last time you spoke to someone who wasn't in your newsroom?" not a politician or a think tank analyst, but someone who was living paycheck to paycheck. The reporter blinked, indicating a slight hesitation, but it was subtle. Vance probably didn't give her time to reply recently because if he had, you would have realized that people aren't just whining about their pay. They're also talking about neighborhood crime, schools failing their children, losing their jobs, and policies created by people who will never have to deal with the fallout. To be honest, he replied, straightening, "You're not really asking me that question for them, y'all. You're asking it to frame a narrative to put me on the defensive." A few audience members clapped as they sensed the change in momentum. Once more, the crowd roared, louder this time. Although Andrea maintained her composure despite her somewhat strained jaw, Vance wasn't done for a few moments, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Andrea Holt, holding a microphone, maintained a rigid stance and an inscrutable expression, but anyone observing closely could see the little change in her posture and the way her fingers curled slightly closer around the microphone, something she hadn't anticipated that J.D. Vance remained at the platform, allowing the impact of his remarks to sink in. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't talking nervously. He was taking control, and the audience wasn't sure whether to cheer or wait. A few reporters in the press area scrawled frantically, their cameras rolling, recording every second as some supporters exchanged glances, their excitement palpable. Then Vance spoke again, "You see, Andrea," in a forceful but measured tone. People's frustration stems not from politicians' poor speeches, but rather from their perception that no one pays attention to them. Not the government, the media, or those claiming to speak for them. Andrea remained motionless, but her lips were pulled together in a thin line. "You ask me a question that is intended to give the impression that I don't care. That's the play, right? Because if you can make me the antagonist, you can avoid having to deal with the true problems." Vance wasn't done. "I grew up in Middletown, Ohio, and my family struggled. I know what it's like to have bills piling up and not enough money to cover them. I know what it's like when your hometown starts to fall apart and no one in power seems to care." A murmur went through the crowd. Some heads turned toward Andrea, waiting for her response. Others nodded, murmuring an agreement. The energy was shifting quickly. You want to discuss pay. If you want to discuss housing, let's talk about the policies that destroyed manufacturing towns across the nation and the places where working-class residents are being forced out as a result of foreign speculators purchasing their neighborhoods. If you want to discuss why individuals feel left behind, perhaps start by asking them instead of assuming you already know the answer. The audience cheered and applauded, and there were several cries of agreement. Although it wasn't tumultuous, the reaction was charged. That wasn't only because you heard something you agreed with. It was also because you felt it. Andrea changed her grasp on the microphone and opened her mouth, but Vance raised a hand just enough to say, "I'll answer any questions you have, Andrea." He spoke in a firm, steadfast tone, but let's make sure it's a real discussion rather than a show. The cheers increased once more. Andrea's expression was inscrutable as she exhaled. She had posed a question, and he had responded, but the room now belonged to them, and the actual moment was approaching. The energy in the room had completely changed, and while the cheers were still settling, the intensity had not diminished. Van remained steadfast at the podium, his gaze fixed on Andrea Holt. She continued to hold the microphone, but for the first time that night, it was unclear whether she had anything more to say as the quiet drew on. Before continuing, Vance leans forward a little to give the situation time to settle. "Andrea is someone you know," he said. "I don't blame you for asking that question," in a calm but thoughtful tone. "I get that you have a job to complete and that your employer expects a specific kind of story. But let's face it," he let the words hang for a beat. "You came here tonight to trap me, not to have a meaningful talk." Some supporters laughed knowingly, while others watched intently to see where Vance was taking this. "You had that question prepared before you even entered the room, and it didn't matter what I set up here or what the people in this room were truly worried about. You were going to ask something that would fit the story your network had already written before this event even began." Andrea's lips parted slightly, but she didn't say anything. "I've seen it before, a clip taken out of context, a headline meant to incite outrage, a soundbite that distorts reality, and it worked, doesn't it? When was the last time you truly covered what was going on in places like Middletown? He cocked his head slightly. Youngstown, Toledo. When was the last time you visited a town where the conversation was about their children's schools lacking enough instructors rather than Twitter trends? Some in the crowd clapped, while others whispered in agreement, realizing that's the problem. Vance went on, "You want to talk about people being left behind? They already know it. They feel it every day when their paychecks don't go as far. They work more hours for less money. Their communities are being left behind. And nobody in your newsroom or in Washington bothers to ask them what they really need." The cheers grew once more, louder this time, and the worst part is that the audience leaned forward as Vance spoke, his voice lowering just enough. "You're going to leave here tonight and return to your studio," Andrea swallowed, "and you're still not going to report on what these people are telling you right now. You'll claim that I deflected, you'll label this populist rhetoric, and you'll figure out a way to ensure that nobody at home actually hears what the people in this room want you to hear." Andrea's jaw tightened. She wasn't trembling. She was too seasoned for that, but the pressure of the situation had caused her composure to somewhat erode. Before making his last point, Vance paused the clapping for a few seconds. So when he said, "Let me ask you a question," the audience fell silent. "If you truly care about the people being left behind," Andrea said, his tone measured, "why does it take a politician calling you out on a stage like this for you to finally pay attention to them?" Andrea gripped the microphone tighter. Silence, not a single word. Not from Andrea, not even from the audience, not even from the press section. The quiet was so oppressive that it caused people to move in their chairs, clear their throats, and look about as though they were looking for someone else to break it. Vance didn't gloat or smile. Instead, he simply let the words hang there thick in the air. Andrea, the crowd wasn't waiting for her response anymore. They had already made up their minds. Hold still had the microphone in her hand, but for the first time that evening, she wasn't sure what to do with it. Her usual confidence and sharp, ready-to-fire comebacks were gone. There was more going on in the room than simply the conversation between J.D. Vance and Andrea Holt. It was about all it stood for. Some people chuckled and nudged their neighbors, murmuring about how she had walked straight into that one. Others clapped and even cheered. Vance noticed that some of them had likely seen the identical sight 100 times before, with politicians dodging reporters and wheeling about. There was never really anything stated, but this was different. Before he spoke again, he paused for a few more seconds. He stated in a firm voice, "I didn't come here tonight to win an argument with a reporter." Vance didn't flinch when I answered my question. He said, "You're deflecting, Senator," but her tone wasn't as firm as before. "You still haven't answered my question," she said, her tone laced with forceful composure. "I came here to talk to you, to the people who actually live with the consequences of the decisions being made in Washington and in newsrooms across this country." Andrea took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't going to go down completely without a fight. The audience echoed with another mutter. Andrea's eyes darted toward the cameras, seemingly begging for someone to intervene and tip the scales, but nobody did. Then, a man in his 50s, standing close to the front, spoke up. He was wearing a work jacket that was a little too worn to be for show, and his voice was rough, like he had been talking over factory machinery for years. He was right when he said, "We are struggling, but she sure as hell ain't the one to speak for us." The room erupted in laughter, applause, and agreement. Andrea's expression grew stern. The man shook his head. "So perhaps try listening to us instead of coming with preconceived notions." "I'm here to report that," she said, her voice louder now, as if attempting to retake control. "This time, please applaud louder." Andrea's mouth opened a little before closing again. "People like Andrea here don't think you need a voice. They think they already know what's best for you. They think they can step in and frame the conversation and tell you what you're supposed to believe." The crowd was fired up now, but you don't need a reporter to tell you what's wrong in your community. That's what Vance said when he took a moment to run with it. The group erupted in applause as Vance went on to say, "You live it every single day, and that's why their narrative is collapsing, and that's why people are pushing back." Andrea appeared to want to say something, but she knew she had lost the room and had nothing else to say. "This isn't about left or right," he said. It's about who actually listens and who just talks. I think we all saw the difference tonight, as the applause was deafening. Vance could have continued, but he didn't need to, because the point had already been made. Instead, he took a step back from the podium to allow the energy to settle before delivering his final remarks. When Andrea Holt gradually lowered her microphone, the entire conversation changed, and the room's energy not only changed, but also changed JD. What had begun as a political demonstration had been transformed by Vance into a time of reckoning that compelled everyone, regardless of their position, to should give the game being played in front of them a bit more thought. Vance knew that what had just happened wouldn't remain in this room. It would be clipped, analyzed, debated, and some networks would twist it, while others would ignore it, and others would be forced to acknowledge that something real had just happened. However, at this moment, what mattered was the people in this room. Vance exhaled, rolling his shoulders back slightly, and his posture was loose and unconcerned. He then said, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, "And if no one else wanted to interrupt, could I resume my speech?" The audience yelled, cheered, laughed, and applauded, all of which blended into a wave of unadulterated passion. However, one older man in the second row, who was most likely in his late 60s, raised a hand instead of clapping. The senator said, "I've been voting for over 40 years, and I've watched politicians from both sides come through towns like mine, shake hands, make promises, and then disappear. So why should I believe you're any different?" Vance saw him without hesitation. "Go ahead, sir," he said, nodding in his direction. The room fell silent once more, this time with anticipation rather than stress. Vance continued, "You shouldn't hesitate," and a few startled mutterings swept through the crowd. Andrea Holt arched an eyebrow. Vance went on, "You shouldn't believe me just because I say something that sounds good up here." He paused, looking around the room, but then he said, "You can hold me accountable." He said, "You can watch what I do when the cameras aren't rolling. When there isn't an election coming up, you can see if I show up in your town when there is nothing in it for me. A beat passes, then another. And if I don't," Vance shrugged, "then don't vote for me." After examining him for a while, the older man nodded slightly, acknowledging rather than agreeing. Vance faced the throng once more. He shook his head, saying, "They don't realize that people are waking up, asking questions, and pushing back. And tonight was proof of that." The audience erupted again. "This whole system is broken," he said, adding, "We all know it. The people in power lie to you. The media manipulates you. And too many politicians on both sides have gotten comfortable with that game." Some stood cheering and clapping, while others just took in the moment, their expressions serious, their thoughts replaying what they had just seen. With a level tone, Vance said, "I'm not here to tell you that I have all the answers. No politician does. But what I do know is that this change doesn't start in Washington, but right here in rooms like this with people who are willing to ask the hard questions and actually listen to the answers." He let the applause wash over him, but he wasn't done yet. Those statements resonated with the audience. The rally was over, but the conversation was just getting started. If you made it this far, you're the type of person who doesn't just listen to what you're told. You think for yourself. If you want more content that actually challenges the way things are presented to you, make sure to subscribe. Andrea Holt shifted in her seat, staring down at her notes. Her mind was probably already calculating how this would be framed on the evening news. Vance didn't care. He had said what needed to be said, and whether or not the media tried to twist it, the people in this room would remember what actually happened tonight.